Thank you. This is one of the very few stories I had that I was given by my great uncle, Joseph York, great uncle Joe. And he's a man who I really wish that I had met earlier and more often. And Joseph York was, I don't know quite when he was born, but he was brought up in the 1880s on, excuse me, that's the phone again. He was brought up in the 1880s on what you might call the leather streets of Northampton. But his grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, Samuel York, his home was in Ecton, a village 5 miles to the east of there. And Ecton at that time was a typical English village, like so many, unchanged really for quite a few hundred years. It was jointly ruled by the squire and the rector. Now the squire, because his family had owned the land for miles around and all the buildings on it for generations. He was like a king in his own country. What he said went, and if he didn't like what you were doing, you had a visit from his bailiff, and that meant that you were evicted from your home. There was also the rector. Now, if the squire looked after the land, the rector, well, he looked after the church. And that meant that professionally, at least, he had God on his side. And that in those days really counted for something. It had a lot of clout, even with the squire. In the village, there were also quite a bunch of shoemakers, my great-great-grandfather Samuel York among them. And according to Uncle Joe, these shoemakers, outworkers for Northampton's leather trade, well, the way that they worked was they'd stitch their own pieces in the, if possible, in the daylight in their cottage doorways, and then once a week it would be taken in to Northampton to the leather factories and made up into the boots and shoes, for which Northampton was at least then internationally famous. And according to Uncle Joe, they were a pretty outspoken political lot. But the most outspoken of them all was a man called Johnson, not the Johnson you're thinking of, I'm glad to say. But there was at that time, and for I know there still is, quite a large tribe of Johnsons in the village of Ecton. And one Friday night, Johnson was sounding off in the World's End, which is the pub. It's on the Wellingborough Road. It's still there. I can see various nods at the top end of Ecton. It ain't right, he was saying. It ain't right. Every week, every Sunday, we go to church. The end of the service comes. We all had to stand up when the parson gives the blessing. And then we had to stay standing up while the squire steps out into the aisle, polishes his hat, waits there till his missus comes, offers her his arm, and the two of them process down the aisle. And after them, there's the gentlemen farmers and folk of that sort of quality and all the rest, until finally it's us poor folk, and we had to stand there not making a sound, not moving until they're all past. And it ain't right, I tell you, it ain't right. And somebody in the pub said, yeah, Johnson, but who's going to do something about it? How about you, Johnson? And before he knew what he was doing, Johnson's last drink spoke for him. And it said, very well then, I will. This Sunday, you see if I don't. Well, Sunday came round, and church as usual, Johnson slipped in at the very last minute, and he was wearing a tailcoat, one of those with a split tail. He'd borrowed it from somewhere, who knows. And he slipped at the last minute and sat down in his usual pew at the back. Service went off as usual. At the end, everyone stood up. The parson gave the blessing, and they stayed standing. Well, the squire moved out into the aisle, polished his hat. His missus moved out next to him. He offered his arm. The two of them processed down the aisle, and then in front of them, out from his pew, stepped Johnson. And he marched down the aisle in front of them. And then I can't resist Uncle Joe's own lovely words at this point. To make assurance doubly certain, he parted the tails of that coat over his backside, and he blew a loud blast. Then out of the church, and he hopped over the wall into his garden, which was next door, changed his coat, and for the rest of the day it was, there you are then, I've done it. But he wasn't smiling so much the next morning, because that's when the squire's bailiff came round. Johnson, says he. Squire, he says he ain't impressed by your behaviour yesterday. He's giving you a week's notice to quit your house. You're out. Oh, we'll see about that, said Johnson. And by Wednesday he was ready, because by Wednesday he was knocking on the big front door of the rectory, the posh entrance. And much to the maid's surprise, when she opened it, the rector agreed that he would see Johnson in his study. Johnson, said the rector, I hear that you're in trouble with the squire. Oh, I don't know about that, sir, said Johnson. You ain't heard my side of the story yet. You see, well, I'm sorry if they were offended by what I did yesterday, but the truth of it is, Sunday, truth of it is, well, I was caught short. I couldn't stay. I had to go. And if it offended them, I'm prepared to go along and make my apology, but he hasn't asked to hear my side of the story yet. But that's not what I've come to see you about, sir. What I've come to see you about is next Sunday, when it's the communion part of the service, when everyone comes up to the table at the front and you give them the bread and the wine that you've blessed. Well, when the squire comes up, you've got to refuse him. You've got to turn him away. Johnson, said the rector, are you out of your mind, man? Now, what Johnson just said might not sound terribly serious to many people these days, but it's a bit like asking the rector to refuse the most important man in the village, the most important ritual in the Sunday service. It's like asking the Archbishop of Canterbury to get halfway through the Queen's coronation and saying, actually, Mum, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to put the crown on your head. You aren't up to it. So, Johnson, are you out of your mind? No, sir, said Johnson. No, sir, I've read the rubrics, the word as the back of the Book of Common Prayer, the book that we all have in church. And it says there that if any man shall come to the Lord's table for Holy Communion with malice and hatred in his heart, then you're to refuse him. Not my words, sir. That's what it says in the book. And if turning me out of my house is not malice and hatred, then I don't know what it is, sir. Johnson, the squire, looked at him very narrowly. The rector looked at him very narrowly. Looked out of the window, and then he said, leave this with me, Johnson. Leave this with me. Well, Johnson tried to look very calm and collected all of Thursday, but I can tell you he was sweating buckets. But on Friday, the squire's bailiff came round once more. Johnson, says he, Squire says, on this occasion, you can keep your house, he'll let you stay. But, he says he, any more of them capers, any more of that carry on, and you'll be out. And to use Uncle Joe's words at the end of the few stories I did hear from him, so there you are. Thank you. A bit of local history.